Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. I just released my third full-length book, and one of the people who gave it a read said everything sounded great, but her only question as she was reading the book was, "Am I psychic?" So I realized I talked about psychic ability in the book and in lots of my work without necessarily defining it or giving people a way to answer that question. Honestly, I tend to go with the assumption and the belief that anyone who is drawn to my work is psychic and probably has an ability and a capability that is higher than people in the average segment of the population. My experience, having worked with lots of people, is that psychic ability is a human endowment. And what's interesting is it often gets talked about as though it were a special calling or a unique gift or an indication that tells you you ought to have this particular outcome or that particular outcome. And I can often say with confidence when I work with different people that had they been born into an indigenous shamanic culture, from everything I understand, they would have been pulled aside early on and trained from a young age how to use and hone and apply those abilities on behalf of the tribe and as part of the spiritual skills. And you can look at other cultures. You might have been a priestess of Isis or some other long forgotten name of a configuration of relating to the divine when those skills showed up early on, had you been immersed in a culture that recognized and valued those. And I think a good analogy is the sort of idea of musical talent. So, as a child of the 80s, one of the things that they did long about fourth grade was make a bid to get all the kids into music. So, they had an evening where you could come and try to play different instruments and see what you liked. And the upshot of that particular night for me was playing the clarinet badly through the end of high school. And of course, through the experience of music or singing or drama or any of these kind of things, the children with massive gifts kind of rise to the top of, that particular container of your elementary or high school. And if they have the passion, the determination, and infrastructure that works for that, and the general inclination to go that route, they can end up routed into making it a career and training at a much higher level than is available in your average high school. And for those who become professional musicians, or in the case of what we're using the analogy for, professional shamanic practitioners, there's usually quite a lot of natural talent. So there's a higher than average natural ability. And then on top of that, there's the determination and the willingness to develop it. And that being said, though, I would argue that there's a tremendous amount of working with the unseen world, being able to access information from energy is sort of what it amounts to. I personally use the shamanic framework, so I'm talking to power animals and guides, listening to a drum, going into an altered state, using that to sort of peek through the veil, take a look around, gather some information, and bring it back and present it, as well as working with energetic interventions where I move something energetically with the help of my guides with my focus and intention, and that creates impact on someone's life. So soul retrieval is a very complicated but great example of this. But I would argue that the average walking around person who thinks that, Reiki is a lot of silliness still has their own psychic ability. It's just that when we live in a culture that the mainstream denies it, and the fact that it can show up in so many different ways, we often grow up without a vocabulary to talk about it, without having our experience validated. So I think there's variation in how things show up visually or how things show up in an auditory way. But as a young child, we have that, hear a sound and everyone responds to it. And there's this sort of shared experience of the meaning. And so a young child begins to associate the doorbell sound with this movement where the dogs bark or the people go to the experience. And when it comes to psychic ability, this can show up in a lot of different ways. And one thing that's interesting is if it is something that you develop, you can certainly develop your ability to get psychic information in a lot of different ways. Certainly, learning shamanic journey was one of the ways that I learned to develop this ability. And for some people, they're naturally more visual. They see images either physically, you can sometimes see a shimmer or a movement with what feels like your naked eye, or you can also end up perceiving in your mind's eye a particular picture. There's clairaudience, where people hear things. There are signals that we get in our body. So, if you've ever had the full body chills with a piece of information that was really, really resonant, I feel like there's a response to a particular energy that can be explained in a number of different ways, but that's the one I tend to go with. Some people like to play with pendulums or tarot cards or particular symbols that are meaningful to them. And a lot of times, very young children who come to me later get in trouble as a kid for blurting out things that they'd never been told or they, in theory, would have no way of knowing. And the response in many households is people being really uncomfortable with that or really confused or having a negative reaction. And again, if you're a young psychic child, probably the first deployment of your psychic ability goes into reading the room. And granted, there's a huge range of how good or bad children are at reading the room, but noting the emotional landscape of these adults that have so much power over you is a darn useful thing to be able to do. And the more kind of outside of functionality a household happens to be, the more urgently the instincts can deploy psychic ability in this way. So I know I'm kind of covering a lot of ground for how this shows up, but one of the things that I really sort of see in the world as far as just general psychic ability is if you have someone who's unregulated in some way in a public space, say they're in a grocery store and they haven't done anything weird and there's no really obvious clue, their personal space, though, even in a busy store, could suddenly be quadrupled. People are deciding that they don't need to go grab the apples next to them at exactly this moment. And interestingly, this may not even be anything that registers consciously for their surrounding shoppers. They may just kind of move away from the person without it even coming to the level of surface where they make a conscious decision. And we can look at all of these different cues of body language or a lot of subtleties, but I think that even people who really aren't that nuanced to, sort of social cues and things like that, still, if somebody's energetic matrix is really wonky because of substance use or mental illness, there's a response of, proceed with extreme caution that is really built into us. And I believe that we're all constantly receiving energetic information. It gets really complicated in the modern era because we live with a level of psychic noisiness that most of the time our ancestors didn't contend with. I feel like, Victorian era London may have been as loud as the modern era, but a lot of people were living, in rural environments with, sheep farms and, more trees than people or whatever variation of that. And so, in a really psychically noisy environment where there's a whole lot going on, like an airport, it's very easy for people to get discombobulated. And so, the whole complexity of not having training or reflection or feedback or vocabulary really makes it complicated for people to develop this sense because it isn't validated in the way that a child's other senses are validated because their way of perceiving something could look so different. I think it's kind of funny that our culture has attributed this sort of psychic knowingness to animals. So there are plenty of people who are like, I want to see how the dog responds to this person. Oh, if animals like them, they must be a good person, which of course is a huge fallacy. There are plenty of people who attune well with animals who rationalize appalling bad behavior, but there's still kind of an amusing like, oh, animals have really good instincts, they have this ability to read people kind of thing, and yet we don't necessarily have our own self-trust. So if you put down any part of you that has kind of taken in the sort of cultural statusy, few the chosen, it being, a gift from spirit in some way because you're special or important or you have a really great destiny. I think those kind of thoughts can be very appealing on one level, but I feel like the flip side of that coin is a lot of imposter syndrome and discomfort and anxiety, and just take it as a given that we generally, as humans, if something's not in the way, are endowed with psychic ability, and we happen to live in a culture that makes our ability to read energy and have it mapped into some kind of a mental or sensory experience from which we can glean information, a more difficult skill to develop. And I'm a huge believer in growth mindset as far as fixed mindset. So basically, what that says is if you have fixed mindset, you're sort of like the gods of yore or whoever have bestowed upon me these particular attributes, and therefore I am good at these things and bad at those things. So you could be like, oh, I'm just not good at math as a, kind of a response. And what our education would say is in modern technological developed nations, there's generally an understanding that a certain competence with math is necessary. And so we have math classes, and in order to graduate high school, you have to show a fundamental competence. And if you are bored by the subject, which is a very common thing with all the teenage hormones and emotionality raging, it can be hard to focus on math, or not particularly good at it, that getting the necessary passing grade in math class may be considerably more tedious. But the ability to learn math at a very fundamental level, up until we get into sort of the very highest expressions, the sort of ability to sit down and learn a skill will take you often further than a naturally talented person if you put in the time and the energy, and will, again, up until you get into people with just absolutely wild amounts of natural talent, put you often on par with talented people who didn't have to work as hard. And with psychic ability, there's this sort of interesting aspect where I think that it is quite advantageous if you are not massively psychically open and end up turning that on volitionally rather than inadvertently. So I'm not saying there aren't other aspects to people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia, but one aspect can be just too much psychic openness and this perceiving of the unseen world with no control. For me as a child, I was overstimulated to the point of being dissociative because I was so psychic and sensitive to energy, and it resulted in a lot of discomfort, discombobulation, and frankly being bad at social cues because it was so loud and overwhelming around people that it was very hard to focus and pick up things that were more nuanced. I even ended up with sort of an interesting sensory development where my ability to point in the direction that a noise came from seems to be quite compromised. I can literally think it's, completely the different direction than it's actually happening. And what I believe to be true and have been shown by my guides is that when I was little, processing all of this sensory information in the form of my energetic sensitivity, it just sort of overwhelmed my ability to sort of properly develop the sense of hearing or the sense of smell. I have a poor ability to correlate other than a very small number of scents with, what they correlate to, at least from what I've, observed in other people. So there can be a lot of wackiness that emerges from wide open, untrained psychic ability. And one of the interesting things of this particular period of time is I would argue that we have the highest per capita density of old souls that we've had in a long time. Because people who've been involved in incarnations, maybe felt complete with being a sheep farmer in the dark ages, are jumping in with a lot of excitement for the modern world. The internet age is really a potent thing. The levels of safety, even 100 years ago, our ancestors in a lot of places couldn't have imagined the level of physical safety that we enjoy in many places throughout the world. For sure, there's some hot spots, but in general, the murder rate has gone down. We're still working some stuff out. I'm not saying humanity should rest on its laurels, but when you start to look statistically at the hardships of incarnation that were inflicted by other humans, there really is a beautiful golden era that is happening on the planet. Even the secure access to food, the percentage of people who have that is quite unprecedented. Even going back 50 years, it's a wonderful and remarkable thing. So lots of old souls have jumped into this incarnation thing, and one of the things that often causes mischief in their lives is these past lives where they did put their awareness between worlds. They did have this incredibly trained and developed psychic ability along with the natural gifts, and the gifts can carry forward, but the training does not. The rigorousness of sitting and learning to put yourself in a bubble and filter things out and direct where your awareness goes. These are kind of tedious. And interestingly, in this sort of modern era of capitalism environment, and I always say I'm not against capitalism, but it's really useful to understand the impacts. One of the things that's very true in my practice is I'm always trying to find the intersection of things that I'm excited to do, that I believe will provide genuine value for people, and that people are willing to pay me for. And this applies, I believe, very much across the board. And so having someone teach you some tedious, rigorous drills to train your ability to play open shut them with your psychic ability just doesn't sell as well as a Reiki attunement or looking into your past lives or things like that. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it is very useful to know that someone who is tremendously psychic doesn't mean they're reliable about the information they get. So a lot of times there's almost a backlash because this part has been disbelieved or dishonored, and your known felt sense. You've sometimes even been gaslighted if you're in a particular relationship. The person who, might be stepping out of the monogamy agreement and swearing up and down they're not. And, in your heart of hearts, you really know that doesn't feel true. So we can almost end up in some cases becoming super determined, like, no, if I perceive this psychically, it is set in stone. And I would argue that it's most functional to treat this as a very real, definite sense and as something that is very interpretive and can move and change at times. And the louder the environment and the more emotionally activated you are, the less reliable the sense is going to be. And interestingly, if you look into, people's reliability about their other senses, those state of affairs, the more additional chaos and stimulus there is, and the more emotionally activated they are, the less reliable people are of what they visually saw or what they heard spoken. You can have multiple eyewitnesses passionately debating that they completely saw this thing or they completely saw that thing, and they're diametrically opposed, and both people were standing there with a clear view of a particular experience. So, coming back to kind of the foundation, I would say that humans are psychic in general. How we train or develop that skill makes a huge difference to its accuracy and usability. Being wildly gifted and incredibly psychically open can cause a lot of mischief in the modern world, and a lot of people don't account for confirmation bias when they end up relaying their psychic information. So, the more calm and emotionally detached you are, and often if you're looking at other people instead of yourself, you can get much more reliable information, and it should always be treated with a grain of salt. And there's every opportunity to move this into a very useful part of anything that you're up to in the world. And I would argue strongly in favor of the incredible merits of a layperson's competence with energetic sensitivity and psychic ability. And so what I mean by that is, as someone who, does this professionally, I have professional level of confidence and competence with my psychic ability. And even then, I tend to include taking this with a grain of salt. This is what it looks like to me. I very much want that process of my looking into the unseen world, coming back and reporting to be additional information and perspective that people can pick up or not pick up as they choose, because I so hold the idea that my clients are ultimately sovereign in their lives, and I might get an hour and a half on the phone with them, but they're going to go forth and live everything. And a little bit of a side note, but I think it's an important way to treat guidance. Our guides can recommend things. They can say, well, if you go down that path, you may not like the outcome. Would not recommend if asked, but it's not their job to direct us or tell us what to do. And anytime someone's abdicating their power to spirit, oh, spirit told me this or spirit told me that, and then there were some kind of complicated or disastrous consequences, it's a interesting kind of way that events come together. Also, while there can certainly be momentum tunnels on destiny paths, which I mean that everything's lining up where something has a really likely particular outcome, we still live in the realm of free choice. So if a truck is barreling down the freeway in the fast lane, it's probably not going to get off at this exit that's coming up in a quarter of a mile. But you never know. You see people sometimes, realize that's their exit and cut across lanes of traffic and even back up to make the off ramp rather than going half a mile down the road to have a more graceful experience. So anything that feels certain as far as outcome based on psychic information, it's just not kind of what that is good or reliable for, any more than when we picture a scenario in our head and we sort of run, what would it look like to go to this party or get this degree or take this trip. We may be able to get some really useful information, but we may also find that the lived experience looks very, very different than the thing that we imagined. And I think humans are so funny with their relationship to authority, and I can certainly find this in myself, where on one level we have this longing to just be told what to do. Just tell me what to do, give me a structure, give me instructions, and I'll do it, and then I'll get the results. I don't want to think, I just want you to tell me what to do. And then when someone does, we have all of this pushback and power struggle, and we work that out sometimes inside of ourselves. Sometimes people bring that into their relationship with spirit. So there's just an interesting thing where we love maps and structure, and we fight with compliance or that kind of thing. If you're a physical therapist and you're a good physical therapist and you tell the person, like, here's the issue that you're having with this part of your body, here are the 3 exercises you need to do to strengthen that before our next session, a very significant portion of the people will do the exercises in front of the physical therapist, go home, have good intentions to do them, and then be non-compliant or be semi-compliant, even though they really want that part of their body to get better. And looking at that and finding that within ourselves with compassion and humor, I think is super useful. But if you're ever feeling frustrated about finding a direction and not feeling like you're coming into clarity, just note that it probably means that some part of you is really ambivalent about outcomes. And even if you got really clear information, there would probably be a part of you that struggled against it and fought with it. So I think often it's a much better exercise to go within and find the tensions that we have within ourselves about a given choice or course of action and sort of get to the root of what our fears and hopes are about something, and hold space for ourselves kind of internally to work some stuff out before we try to commit to a course of action. But I digress. I talk about that elsewhere. So coming back to psychic ability, I think it's completely reasonable to say, if you are listening to this podcast, yes, you absolutely have psychic ability. Now, if you have not trained it, it may not be something that you can consciously access, and different forms of training work better for different people. And there's a certain amount of caution, the sort of love of things like mushrooms and ayahuasca tourism, I think, really reflect people's desire for big, spectacular experiences rather than the work of building a muscle. Because I think in the delving into psychic ability, if you don't properly develop your ability to close down your perceptions, to control what you're looking at, to really have it happen on your terms and really use it if you're going to engage in a conscious way, it can cause a lot more problems in your life. And the good news is there's a part of us, it's not our conscious thinking mind, but there's a part of us that is fully online for taking energetic information and putting it into the great soup pot of inputs and allowing us to move in an appropriate way. So what I mean by that is we get millions of bits of information every second by being in a body. And the guides like me to use the analogy of, if you were an archer who was hunting for food with a bow and arrow, even when you weren't hunting, you would probably have a certain awareness of what direction the wind was blowing or how fast it was blowing. And yet, if you were asked as a modern person sitting inside to remember the direction of the wind last time you were outside, unless you had a very particular specific reason to note it, like it was really intense, or you're in Southern California and the Santa Anas are playing havoc with your allergies, you would probably have no idea. And yet we're getting the same sensory input as the person who, knows that they need to calibrate their arrow shot according to, how the wind is blowing, or someone who's hunting animals, understanding upwind or downwind, very, very relevant. Totally not for most modern people most of the time. So what's useful to recognize about this, though, is the supercomputer of our brain is taking all of the information, everything that's happening, what our skin is sensing, the many noises around us, whether or not we hear from them. And a lot of them just don't need to make it to the conscious mind. So if you think about a company that's working and thriving really well, there's a lot of minutia that doesn't get run up to the CEO or the vice president, and yet is being handled competently on another level. So we can notice that we don't want to trip over a pothole without necessarily having a lot of kind of conscious engagement. It's almost like our body has taken that in and moved and made an adjustment. And when we get too much in our head or too disconnected from our body and our senses, that's when a lot of us have way more vulnerability to tripping in the pothole and things like that. But when we're embodied and we're present and we're centered and we're not overly distracted, there's a huge amount of all the information, all these things going on that don't need to bother the stream of consciousness that is capable of paying attention to a much smaller number of things at a time. And our psychic ability is one of those. And that's where, going back to the grocery store, people giving a wide berth to someone who hasn't done anything overtly obvious that would be concerning, that they weren't kind of operating in the same reality as everyone else, but someone who's maybe mentally ill and has a lot of, energetic disturbance around them and a lot of unpredictability, or they're sitting on a lot of rage, or any of these things, it can have us registering in a really seamless kind of way. So the good news is, if you aren't someone who's particularly training those abilities, then you can just sort of let your psychic ability be an ally to you in the same way that your sight and your hearing and the parts of you that are keeping note of whether it's time to take a breath, and the sensations that are happening in your body. If you've ever done one of those mindfulness exercises where you stop and you really tune into the body, there's a lot of information that's happening, but it isn't being run up the sort of chain of command into the conscious mind. One of my teachers will get ready to do like an exercise of some kind, and it'll be like, oh, adjust your body to see if you're comfortable. And a lot of us have no idea that we've been in a position way too long, or something's uncomfortable, or there's a small adjustment that would make things feel better as we get quiet and we go internally. And so just noting that you can trust your psychic ability often to operate in the background. If you don't feel like you're naturally having spectacular, spontaneous, unprompted, accidental psychic experiences, that actually tends to make for a lot more functional kind of life. People who have the sort of involuntary no off switch, they may construct a narrative about how, gifted and important and special and chosen they are. And I get that. I have a lot of compassion for humans making meaning, but as a former engineer, I'm so interested in functionality and what supports us in thriving in our lives. And so what I'd like to offer is, you can say, yes, absolutely, you have psychic ability. You may, in fact, have quite a lot of it. The first step, I would argue, if you want to engage with it consciously, is sort of that layperson training. I was going for that in my energy body illumination program that you can find in my academy, where it's like, here's the manual that anyone who's having their psychic information break through into their conscious awareness should probably have. This would be really useful of things to understand just for personal quality of life. There's a lot of things that modern humans have a layperson understanding of. The math classes we take, and the basic math is a good example of that. And, some general ideas about nutrition and sleep. And then there are things where we're an educated layperson. We know a bit more about these things because we listen to podcasts about, how to maximize our sleep environment, or how to hack our biology for making it get along better with this modern world that we live in. So there's certainly that. And then for the people, once you've got that really solid layperson body of knowledge onboarded, there's the ability to see if you want to expand it into something. Do you want to do readings for other people, or healings for other people, or other things? And everything is wonderful with that. There are just a lot of people who skipped the step of competence with energetic filters and protecting their home and energetic hygiene, and how to use their discernment to make sense of who they're talking to. A lot of people have entity problems because they're talking to beings that aren't in bodies, that aren't spirit guides, and therefore aren't constrained by working for their highest and best good in a way that really does align with that. And I think it's valid, to take pride in a skill that you've developed, that you get a lot of joy out of, that you're using well. But there's also, when you're looking at other people, have a bit of discernment if someone is giving off Messiah vibes, the whole special, chosen, superior, should not be bound by the rules of other people. One of my more spectacular, memorable, so many life lessons bound into one was my very first Reiki teacher. And this was a young woman who had enormous psychic gifts, very little ability to differentiate between her magical thinking that had her, having deep, profound relationships to people that she'd seen on TV that were, just unfolding before her. I moved her into my house because she was in a difficult kind of situation and didn't have secure living environments, largely because she was doing very little work for money. And, she, felt very entitled as the special, important chosen one, not even to have a basic energy exchange of doing chores. And I totally signed up for it. I had such longing for access to my own psychic ability, and there was all this sort of rumbling, and learning Reiki really opened up a lot of pathways, and that was really super exciting for me. And I just really felt like she would bridge me to something or tell me what spirit had to say. And there was a lot of lessons. There was lessons about, don't take strays home if they're human, because it was a lot easier to bring her into my world than it was to get her out. Although in fairness, given that this was her full strategy for living in the world, having people who took her in without being paid in any way. When I really had hit my limit, she had already lined up her next place to be, which was very, very helpful in that regard. And I can completely affirm she had, enormous psychic abilities. In retrospect, also entities and magical thinking and a fair bit of mental illness and an absolute whopper of an entitlement perspective as regarded herself. And so I think that it can be really useful for yourself to just honor this ability and then make choices for yourself about, what you do or don't want to do with it. And simultaneously to just kind of have that discernment when anyone is claiming some kind of exalted moral authority as a result of psychic ability, because I would argue there's very little correlation between psychic ability and being a person who treats others well or for whom there's good in it for other people or beings that they're in the world. So one of the measures that I like to take, I'm all about us putting on our oxygen mask first. So sometimes we don't have a lot of contribution to make to the world because we're busy trying to get our life to baseline, and that's completely valid. But there are also individuals who participate in a way that tends to make things harder for other people. Someone who's running scams or, stealing things. And particularly, I'm putting a lens on people in developed nations who are citizens of the land. There's other complexity that can enter into this in other circumstances. But for that kind of context, one could argue that someone who is involved in grifting or financial scams could also be incredibly psychic and incredibly intuitive and really using those innate abilities in those ways and causing a lot of, mischief and harm in the world. So yeah, so I think it's really great to take the special or chosen label off of that any more than you would for somebody who was, in the top 10% of runners. They might not be an Olympic athlete, but oh my goodness, they could outrun everybody in their high school and compete, well for track meets with other things. You probably would be like, wow, what a cool attribute. It's so neat that you're good at that, but not attribute some of these unrelated qualities. And similarly, recognizing that if your psychic ability isn't breaking into your consciousness all the time, you can bring it that way, which is a wonderful thing to do with learnable skills. And there can be a lot of problems if it's involuntarily breaking into your space in ways that are really disruptive. And that's a whole different problem to solve and work with. So as always, I hope that there's some value and the question I think that's better than am I psychic or do I have psychic ability is how is this helping or hurting me in my life that I have psychic abilities, and what would I really like to do with them? And not in a, oh, I've been gifted these things and I have to use it, because they're talented runners all the time who do a bit of track. They're not elite enough to make a career of it. They're not interested enough. And they might or might not run for fun and recreation, and life goes on. So I would argue that humans all have way more gifts and abilities and undeveloped potential than we could possibly ever actualize. And I think that with psychic ability, it's great to put it very solidly in the realm of personal choice, whether this is something you develop for life enrichment, and that it's something that is probably worth onboarding enough knowledge to work well with the care and feeding of yourself in everyday life. So the basics of energetic hygiene and psychic protection, and being able to make sense of information that breaks into your consciousness, are very useful, learnable skills that, again, I would argue that people can learn, just like most children handed a clarinet and sat down with music and competently learned to play some songs. I joke that I played the clarinet badly, and it was just never something I practiced at home or was particularly passionate about, but it was sort of the track of, this is a good thing to get up to. And so I had those experiences, and there's kind of a fundamental musical knowledge that comes with that I don't have any regrets about, but neither do I feel particularly celebratory. And that kind of neutrality can be really, really useful in sorting through this particular aspect of your ability and potential. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.